a small plane that was carrying a newly married couple and several other people because of the thick fog in which they were caught and the lack of visibility for the pilots, and the low altitude they had collided with the top of a tree that was located in the heights of the mountains. A vast forest falls. Some of them survived this accident, but they were seriously injured, and they were caught in the rain, without any shelter in those vast forests. They were in an unknown place and had to face possible dangers, and even though they didn't have much time left, they had to fight to survive. Brandon and Brandy Bailey went to Costa Rica from America for their honeymoon. They had been married for 6 months and had been planning this trip ever since. The two of them were classmates since high school, and even after going to a university and being friends since that time, the story begins when they went to a small town next to Corcovado National Park, which was 100 miles away. They boarded a plane. The flight was something that Brandy was afraid of. The flight had no more than 6 passengers, and the last person who got on the plane was Michael Packard. He was an American immigrant who lived in Costa Rica and used to travel to those areas once in a while. Michael's seat was next to Brandon's and Brandy's seat, so they started talking and getting to know each other better. Brandy, who had a phobia of flying, tried to focus and take deep breaths to overcome her fear of the 30-minute flight. Leave it behind. Costa Rica is a small country with dense forests and towering mountains, so on a cloudy day, flying at low altitude can be very dangerous. And that day, unfortunately, the sky was cloudy and the weather conditions were not very favorable. Michael, who used to go to those areas for a while, every year, and had experienced this flight many times, this time he noticed something strange. He saw that the pilots were talking to each other while holding the map in their hands, and by looking at the coordinates of this map, he tried to... They are determining the location of the route. They were not sure where the plane was located. Either the aircraft's equipment, including the altimeter and radars, did not work properly, or the pilots were novices, and due to being caught in a sea of clouds and insufficient visibility, they tried to rely on the charts and maps they had in their hands. They didn't realize that they had left the main route for a long time and were flying towards a mountainous area. The fog they were trapped in was so thick that the sky was getting darker and darker by the minute, as if they were moving in a dark pit. Being until one moment the plane hits a tree that was located in the mountains, and they fall between all the trees and foliage, and this is how all of Brandy's fears become reality. After falling, Brandon miraculously regains consciousness. The last image he remembers was the moment he fell. The weather was very cold and his whole body was covered in airplane gasoline. His whole body was frozen and his legs were numb, so he couldn't move. When he turned his head, he saw Brandy lying unconscious right on top of him. He called Brandy with a shout. Then he stretched out his hand towards her and shook her and shouted that Brandy woke up while Brandy was coughing and gasping for air. Then he tells Brandy to save you and get out of there before the plane catches fire. When Brandy pulled herself out of the wreckage, she saw a horrifying sight. The plane was broken into pieces and smoke was rising from it, and the lifeless bodies of the 2 pilots who were in the front of the plane. Then he saw 2 other passengers who had pulled themselves out of the plane and were seriously injured. According to the scene he had seen, he wondered how they survived the crash. The gasoline of the plane had spilled, and Brandon was stuck inside the wreckage of the plane. He had fallen and was trying to pull his legs out from under the corpse and save himself. Finally, with a lot of effort, he manages to pull himself out of there, and as soon as he gets out, he pushes Brandy and the other 2 passengers away from the plane, because all their bodies were covered in gasoline and they might catch fire. One of the passengers, named Alvaro, who was seriously injured and a part of his body was burned, was unable to move at all, so Brandon dragged him away from the plane. They were very lucky to have survived this accident. The front part of the plane was completely crushed. The fact that they were sitting in the back rows made them survive. Brandy, who had studied nursing at the university, took a look at Brandon's condition and saw that his head was broken, his eyes were black, and his face was swollen, and there were deep cuts on his arm, and he was bleeding profusely. She tries to cover the bleeding area with a cloth, stop the bleeding. After that, she goes to another survivor named Celica. She was shocked by the death of her boyfriend Adolfo, and was only staring at one point. When Brandy talks to her, she realizes that she was conscious during all the moments of the fall and witnessed everything until the last moment. Bode Cirque was not physically harmed, but it seemed that he suffered psychologically. It was at this moment that Brandon Yehu remembered Michael, the same passenger who was sitting next to them. He was not among the passengers. That's why he started calling Michael and his name and shouting. Michael was thrown out of the plane in this crash, and he was half unconscious on the ground, 200 feet away. When he heard Brandon's voice, he opened his eyes, and he just remembered what happened to them. At that moment, with all the fractures in his body, his adrenaline rose and he got up and started walking towards the sound he heard. The tendon of one of his legs was severed and one side of his face was completely crushed. 4 of his ribs were broken and his lung was punctured. But despite all this, he did not feel much pain at that moment and was walking beautifully. As soon as Michael, seeing that he didn't fall to the ground, Brandy quickly realized the serious problems that had arisen for Michael. Brando said that if help did not come quickly, we would most likely lose Michael, but it was somehow impossible for help to arrive quickly, because they were miles away from their destination, and Michael Alvaro's condition was very serious, and the countdown to the end of his life had begun. Brandon, I hear a voice from inside the plane that sounds like a wireless, and someone is speaking in Spanish. It didn't take long before the voice got clearer and clearer, and he was sure he heard a wireless from the cockpit. But going back to the wreckage was a big gamble. With gasoline leaking and the plane catching fire, the plane could explode at any moment, but Brandon makes a difficult decision at that moment. He decides to go into the cockpit so that he can use the radio and call for help, considering the situation he is in. They were trapped, and Michael and Alvaro were in dire condition. This was the only way to save them. Brandon somehow passes through a bunch of broken glass and sharp and crumpled metal and reaches the cockpit himself, and sees that every pair of them are dead. It had stopped working and no sound came out of it anymore, and they lost this hope. It didn't take long before a heavy rain fell, and the fire of the plane went out and washed away all the fuel that had been released from the plane. Also, they were able to give some water to Michael, who was severely dehydrated. With the coming of rain, the temperature was getting lower and colder by the minute. Andrew Brandy took Michael and Alvaro under the roof of the only shelter that was left for them, which is the wreckage of the plane, and they sat under the tree with Silica and hugged each other until maybe this way they can warm each other. At the same time, they heard the sound of a helicopter from above. It was a rescue helicopter, and it was sent to find the possible survivors of this terrible crash. It was patrolling the area. The helicopter was flying right above the wreckage and the survivors. They were happily waving to the rescuers, but soon the helicopter changed its direction and left as if the rescuers could not see the wreckage and the survivors. The trees of the forest completely covered the heads of the survivors, and this probably made the rescuers unable to recognize them. The survivors came to them for the second time. Their hope, loss, and depression in the shadow of that dark and rainy forest. It was getting dark little by little, and they were lost in thousands of hectares of dark and cold forest, and having no lights or other equipment. The weather was getting colder and colder, and Brandy was also soaked and shivering. Because of this, her husband Brandon came to take care of them. He and the rest of the survivors go around with Silica to see if they can find a shelter for the night. A little while away from the crash site, their eyes fell on an open suitcase, whose contents had been spilled out. Silka was a shopkeeper, and he had bought some cloths and clothes from Costa Rica to take to his shop and sell them. They wanted to go back to the plane after packing their bags, but they lost the way back. All around them were the same, and they could not tell which direction they came from. Although they were not that far from the crash site, they could not find their way back and were lost. On the other hand, if they were moving in the wrong direction, they might be lost forever in that forest. They start screaming and calling Brandy's name and asking for help. The luck was that they were not far from the crash site and their screams could be heard. Brandy arrived, and after hearing his wife's voice, he started calling Brandon. And it happened that Silka and Brando moved in the direction of Brandy's voice and were saved from eternal disappearance. After this incident, they realized that if they are separated from each other, they have less chance to survive. On the other hand, Alvaro and Michael were not in an interesting situation, and their bodies were getting weaker by the minute. Alvaro was comforting Michael with all the pain he was enduring and said, "Don't worry, we will finally be saved with our help." Michael had a punctured lung and was unable to breathe. It was getting harder for him every moment. Brandy used Silka's clothes to warm up Michael and Alvaro, so that they could warm up a little, so that they could last until the morning. The darker the weather, the lower the temperature, and they covered themselves with the cloths and clothes found in Silka's suitcase. They were, but they were still cold. The area where they fell was a forested mountain full of wild animals. The burning smell of the plane filled everywhere. But it seemed that the smell of blood was even more obvious than the smell of burning, and it had drawn the animal there. In the middle of the night, they hear terrible noises from far and wide. In that dark forest, every sound could be a deadly threat. As each time passed, these sounds got closer and closer until Brandon Yahavi's eyes fell on the leaves of a shrub that was shaking. It was obvious that it was an animal in those bushes. Michael and Alvaro, who had lost all their blood and could not move, could be the best targets for this animal. From there, the other three people had to try to get that animal away from there. They didn't have a tool to light a fire, so they started making noise and had to shout to keep the danger away from themselves until morning. On the other hand, Michael was slowly losing consciousness, and Brandon was trying to call him. He would not let her sleep so that they would not lose her. They passed a terrible night, a night that moment by moment was more like a nightmare than reality. Brandy went up to Michael and saw that his breathing was slow, and it looked like he was dying, considering that he had not received food for a long time and his kidneys were bleeding. His body was in the weakest possible state. They were sure that if help did not come, they will lose Michael that day. They had been lost in the remote forest for 18 hours and were badly wounded and hungry. And after the helicopter left, there was no sign of help. On the other hand, Brandon knew that if he wanted to keep himself and the other survivors alive, he had to do something. Giving up would only make things worse. After a long discussion, those three people finally came to the conclusion that they should take a risk and leave that area. They thought they were on the mountain, and if they moved down, they would reach a river, and maybe they could reach a village by continuing the path of that river and call for help so that they could save Michael and Alvaro's lives as well. But as I said, this is not the case. It was a big risk, because it was possible that in the end, this thought would not come true, and they would be lost in the forest forever, and their friends would become food for wild animals. But if they didn't do anything, they would have to witness the death of their friends, and it was not known what would happen to them. When Brandon informed Michael of their decision, he opened his eyes, even though he had no more Johnny left, and gave Brandon a worried look and shook his head, to show that he was against this. They, who are Michael's only hope for survival, finally promised Michael and Alvaro that they will go and come back with help as soon as possible and save them. Those 3 people were going down from the forest mountain with difficulty. It was full of broken branches with large thorns that penetrated into their bodies and wounded them. It didn't take long for them to understand that it was a very difficult decision to make, and due to their lack of water, they were hungry and hungry. Insomnia and the fact that he was injured, this work was somehow impossible. They were trapped in the impassable forest. They couldn't even find their way back, and they were lost in the middle of the forest. They were sitting in a corner with no way back and forward, thinking that this is the end of their journey, and their work is probably over. On the other side, Alvaro and Michael were lying in the wreckage of the plane. Alvaro, who was immobile due to many burns, could only look at Michael, who was breathing hard, and witness the last moments of his life. Michael's punctured lung made it difficult for him to breathe. My color was white as chalk. He was not in a good condition at all. All the survivors of this incident had lost their hope to be saved and were slowly surrendering to death in the forest. At the same time, Michael and Alvaro hear the voices of several people behind them who are shouting and towards them. At first, they think that Brandon, Brandy, and Silka have returned, but to their disappointment, they see several men wearing clothes with the Red Cross logo. To have come to save an army of Red Cross volunteers searched all those areas for 24 hours, and despite the fact that the survivors thought that the rescue helicopter did not see them, it left and no one came to them. But they were searching all this time and finally found the survivors. When Michael saw the rescue and rescue forces, tears flowed from the corner of his eyes. He was at the peak of despair, and just when he thought he was spending the last moments of his life, he saw the rescuers coming towards him to save his life. It was as if he had been given an extra time to live, and the time of his death had not yet come. But soon the rescuers found 3 other survivors who had tried to go down the mountain and were trapped. After being rescued from the jungles of Costa Rica, Silk, Alvaro, and Michael were taken to the hospital and received special care. Unfortunately, after a short period of time, they made a full recovery. Brando and Brandy Bailey's injuries also recovered, and they returned to America, and after some time, they had 2 children. Thank you, friends, who stayed with me until the end of the video. If you liked the video, please like it and send it to your friends. To see new videos, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos. I love you so much. Until the next video.